beyond our galaxy. Beyond our galaxy. We have liftoff in T-minus 30 seconds and counting. All systems are clear and ready for liftoff. The 3 Apollo astronauts are reporting they are ready for liftoff. We have T-minus 5 seconds and counting. Rocket boosters are beginning to ignite. T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff. We have liftoff of the Saturn V rocket, ready to take the 3 Apollo astronauts to the moon and return them safely back to Earth. The Saturn V rocket now is fully operating on all 5 rocket boosters. The Saturn V rocket is now approaching 250 miles high downrange and continues to climb at altitudes of escape velocity. The race to space that began with a beep, beep, beep sound from Sputnik 1 satellite orbiting Earth now becomes a heated race to the moon to see which country can place a man on the moon first. The definition of a rocket is this: a cylindrical projectile that can be propelled to a great height or distance by the combustion of its contents. The definition of a satellite is this: an artificial body placed in orbit around the Earth or Moon to collect information or communicate. After the Russians and Americans launched their first satellite into space, the race to space began to heat up. Sputnik 1. After the Russians launched Sputnik 1 into space, the Americans launched their first successful satellite into space as well, Explorer 1. However, not all the rocket launches were successful at first. The actual first satellite launched by the U.S. ended in failure. Vanguard 1 satellite launched on December 6, 1957, as the U.S. first satellite failed. Well, it's time to go back to the old drawing board and redo this problem. Soon both countries would see that the challenge of the space race would be a dangerous one indeed. The Russians lost their dog Laika on Sputnik 2, while the Americans lost their first satellite. On January 31st, 1957, the U.S. launches successfully the Jupiter C rocket into space. The Explorer 1 satellite safely makes it into low Earth orbit. Hey Sergo, you know this is a friendly space race, don't you? Of course, my old colleague Dr. Von Braun. It's just a little friendly competition. How are things going with you over there, my old colleague? Life is good, Dr. Von Braun, and you look like you have a nice office there. Yes, I do have a nice office here. More room, not cramped like our old one. Life is good. So what is your next space rocket going to be, Dr. Von Braun? Ah, sorry, Sergo. Can't tell you that. You know that secrets between us must be secrets. True, Dr. Von Braun. Well, my colleagues and I must go back to the drawing board again. Good to see you again, my old colleague. Take care and best of space flights to you. On March 15, 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik 3 satellite into space on board this Vostok-type rocket. Sputnik 3 satellite. The Sputnik 3 satellite had 12 different kinds of weather instruments on board it. The purpose of Sputnik 3 was to study the Earth's upper atmosphere. After Sputnik 3 was launched into space by the Russians, the Americans had tried to launch a few more into space of their own. The Americans would have 3 failed launches and 2 successful ones. 3 failed ones were Vanguard 1B, Explorer 2, Vanguard 2A. The 2 successful ones were Vanguard 1C, Explorer 3. Here are some awesome pictures of satellites for you to view. So just sit right back down in an easy chair, relax, and enjoy. There are basically 3 different kinds of satellites that orbit the Earth today. The next 3 pictures will show what these different kinds of satellites are. Weather. A type of satellite is mostly used to continuously check the weather and climate of the Earth. Communications. A satellite placed in Earth's orbit in order to relay television, radio, and telephone signals. Military. A satellite used for military reasons such as intelligence gathering, navigation, and military communication. These are 3 different kinds of rockets as well. These 3 are 1. Solid rocket fuel, 2. Ion rocket, 3. Plasma rocket. The mighty Saturn V rocket is an example of a solid fuel rocket. The X-15 rocket plane is an example of an ion-type rocket. Plasma rockets. Vesemar is an example of being able to take humans to Mars someday on plasma fuel. There are 3 reasons to use rockets. The next 3 pictures will show these rockets' purposes are to launch satellites into space like this Jupiter C rocket did, to launch humans into space, to launch missiles at objects that could harm one's own country. After Sputnik 3 was launched into space and continued to impress the world, the Americans created the next rocket called the X-15 rocket plane. The X-15 rocket plane. 3 of these kind of planes were built by the Americans. Speeds of up to the speed of sound, also known as Mach speed. This was a research type of rocket that would eventually help put the Americans into space. X-15 rocket plane, experimental research plane, Mach speed of 4,520 miles per hour, operated from 1959 to 1968. 199 missions flown with 2 total disasters. Indeed, the race to space was heating up between the Russians and the Americans. The Russians would once more stun the world by doing another first in space. The Russians launched the first human into space on board this Vostok rocket. The Vostok rocket was launched from Cosmodrome in Russia. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, 1934 to 1968. Gagarin would orbit the Earth for 108 minutes. He would orbit some 203 miles above the Earth as well. Cosmonaut Gagarin flew into space on April 12, 1961. He will return back to Earth as a hero. However, the Americans would quickly respond to their next rocket launch into space. Project Mercury had originally 7 astronauts to fly on board the single capsule of Mercury. Mercury Redstone rocket, height 83.38 feet tall, built by the Chrysler Corporation. Missions flew from 1959 to 1963. 6 total missions with 5 successes and 1 failure. Fuel was LOX ethyl alcohol. Total combined time of Mercury flights, 53 hours, 55 minutes, and 27 seconds. American astronaut Alan B. Shepard. Astronaut Shepard became the first American to fly into space. Orbited Earth in his Freedom 7 space capsule. Orbited Earth for 4 hours and 56 minutes. Orbited the Earth 3 times before returning back to Earth. Here is an exploded view of the Mercury Redstone rocket. The next first event was done by the Russians again. They would put the first woman into space. Cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space. Cosmonaut Tereshkova flew into space on a Vostok 6 rocket on June 16, 1963. She was a major general in the Soviet Air Force. The Americans then began sending the Wright Space Project into space that happened between 1961 to 1968. This was a space mission that carried 2 astronauts into space to learn how man could adapt to the environment of space. Project Gemini, a 2-man capsule launched into space on board a Titan II rocket. Gemini was the next project before the Apollo one was, which would carry 3 astronauts into space. The Titan II rocket used a liquid fuel to help send this rocket into space. It had 2 engines to lift it up to space. The Titan II rocket. The rocket had 2 stages on to launch it into space. First stage engine was a LRB 82AJ7 and burned Arizona 50 fuel N2O4. Second stage engine burned Arizona 50 N2O4 fuel as well. Gemini means twins, and so 2 astronauts were used to pilot their capsule above Earth's orbit. Again, the Russians would stun the world by being the first ones to have a man walk in space. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov walked 310 miles above the Earth. His walk lasted for 12 minutes. The Americans would bounce back with their next astronaut. Astronaut Edward B. White II. On Gemini 4 mission, White got out of his capsule on the third orbit and walked for 20 minutes in space. While the Americans and Russians were competing against each other in the race to put a man on the moon, they will be still sending up satellites as well that we will briefly talk about. The first communication satellite launched into space by the Americans was done on this Thor Delta rocket. Telstar 1, first telephone calls from space performed by this satellite. Tyrus 1 is the first to take pictures of Earth from space. Here is what planet Earth looked like when Tyrus 1 took the first picture of it from space. Satellite dishes like this one would be used to transmit and receive communications from the satellites. Corona's satellite would be the first American spy satellite. This was used for photographic surveillance on the Russians between June 1959 to May 1972. The Russians as well continued to send some more satellites into space. Soviet satellite Zenit, military spy satellite used as a photo reconnaissance satellite. Between 1951 and 1994, about 500 of these satellites were launched into space, but now are retired. Moninia, communication satellite that orbits the North Hemisphere. On November 28, 2017, the Russians launched a weather satellite into space, but lost it due to human error. Total loss, $45 million. Here's what Moninia 2-1 satellite would have somewhat looked like had it made it into space. Before we briefly talk about the last two rockets on the show, here are some awesome pictures of rockets to enjoy viewing. So just sit right back down in your easy chair, relax, and enjoy. We will now briefly talk about the Saturn V rocket. Saturn V rocket, used from 1967 to 1973. A three-stage rocket. Apollo program using 3 American astronauts to take them to the moon and back to Earth. First flight, November 9th, 1967. Last flight, May 14th, 1973. The Saturn V rocket, also known as the Mighty Saturn, Here is a picture diagram of the three-stage Saturn V rocket. This rocket had 5 main engines to lift it off the launch pad to take it into space. The space capsule with its landing module sat on top of the rocket. Here is a picture diagram of the Saturn V space capsule. The Apollo space program would eventually inspire not only the Americans, but the whole world as well. The Saturn V rocket. 15 flights with a total of 45 astronauts on board the capsule sitting on top of it took this ride into space. This would include Apollo 7 through Apollo 17 missions. Here's a comparison picture of the Saturn V rocket and our next space rocket called the Space Shuttle. The Saturn V rocket stood 360 feet tall, while the Space Shuttle stood only 184.2 feet tall. This would be a total of 179 feet difference. The Space Shuttle. First launch date, April 12, 1981. The Space Shuttle would carry 7 astronauts into space on 2 reusable fuel tanks and 1 big one. This was a unique rocket in that it was launched into space. It would be the first kind to land instead of splashing down into the ocean to be recovered. Here's a picture of the 5 space shuttles with their names. 2 space shuttles were destroyed. Space Shuttle Challenger blew up in the air 73 seconds after the launch in 1986. The Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated while descending over the state of Texas on February 1, 2003. The powerful launch of the Space Shuttle seen here in this picture. Maximum speed 17,320 miles per hour. Landing of the Space Shuttle. Space Shuttle carried back to its base on a modified Boeing 747. Well, that is all for today's show. But only time will tell what we Earthlings will find when we look up into the night sky and beyond our galaxy.